Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when love was not just complicated, it was governed by rules, rituals, and restrictions that would make modern dating look like child's play. This is the story of medieval love, where passion was forbidden, marriages were transactions, and romance existed in the shadows between duty and desire. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy calm, long-form stories like this one. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always heartwarming to see how these quiet stories of history bring people together from all around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 1150, and somewhere in the rolling hills of France, a young girl named Isabel was learning that her life had already been decided. She was 12 years old, barely past childhood, and yet her father had just informed her that she would marry a man she had never met. His name was Guillaume, he was 37 years old, and he owned 3 manors in Burgundy. That was all she needed to know. That was all that mattered. This was not cruelty, at least not in the eyes of medieval society. This was simply how the world worked. Marriage was not about love or compatibility or even basic human connection. It was about land, about alliances, about ensuring that your family's wealth and status continued into the next generation. Romance, if it existed at all, was something that might develop after the wedding, not before. And if it didn't? Well, that was simply the price of being born into a world where your heart belonged to your family before it ever belonged to you. The concept of marrying for love would have seemed absurd to most medieval people, particularly among the nobility. Love was unpredictable, irrational, and dangerous. It made people do foolish things, abandon their duties, and forget their obligations to family and society. Marriage, by contrast, was a rational arrangement between families, carefully negotiated and legally binding. It was far too important to be left to something as unreliable as human emotion. The process of arranging a marriage began long before the couple ever met. Fathers would negotiate through intermediaries, discussing dowries and inheritance rights with the same attention to detail that modern lawyers bring to corporate mergers. The bride's family would offer a dowry, a payment in cash, land, or goods that would become the property of the groom's family. In return, the groom's family would promise to provide for the bride and any children she might bear. These negotiations could take months or even years, with both sides trying to extract the best possible terms. A wealthy merchant might offer a substantial cash dowry to marry his daughter into the nobility, buying her a title and social status that money alone could not provide. A noble family fallen on hard times might accept a smaller dowry in exchange for marrying their son to a wealthy merchant's daughter, trading their ancient name for desperately needed funds. The bride herself had little say in these arrangements. In most cases, she would not even meet her future husband until the wedding day. Her opinion was not sought, and her feelings were not considered relevant. She was a piece on a chessboard, moved by her father to advance the family's interests. If she was lucky, her husband would be kind. If she was unlucky, well, there was no escape from a marriage once it was made. The Church, which controlled marriage law throughout medieval Europe, did require the consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid. But this consent was often more theoretical than real. A young girl who had been raised to obey her father without question was unlikely to refuse a marriage he had arranged, even if she had the legal right to do so. The social and economic consequences of defying her family would be devastating. For boys, the situation was somewhat different, but no less constrained. A young nobleman might have slightly more input into his marriage, particularly if he was the eldest son and heir to the family estates. But even he was expected to marry for advantage, not affection. His duty was to produce legitimate heirs and strengthen his family's position, not to pursue his own happiness. The wedding ceremony itself was a public affair, designed to witness and legitimize the union. In the early Middle Ages, marriages often took place at the church door rather than inside the building, emphasizing that this was a legal contract as much as a religious sacrament. The couple would exchange vows in front of witnesses, with the groom placing a ring on the bride's finger as a symbol of his commitment. After the ceremony came the wedding feast, which could last for days among wealthy families. These celebrations were not just parties, but displays of wealth and power, opportunities to impress guests and cement alliances. The food would be elaborate, the entertainment lavish, and the gifts expensive. Every detail was calculated to enhance the family's reputation and demonstrate their status. But beneath all the ceremony and celebration lay a darker reality. The wedding night was not a romantic beginning but a legal requirement. The marriage had to be consummated to be valid, and there were often witnesses waiting outside the bedchamber to confirm that the deed had been done. For a young bride who had never met her husband before that day, this must have been a terrifying experience. The morning after the wedding, the bride's family would sometimes display the blood-stained sheets as proof of her virginity. This humiliating ritual served to protect the bride's reputation and ensure that any children born of the marriage would be legitimate heirs. A bride who could not provide this proof might be accused of having been unchaste before marriage, bringing shame on her entire family. Once married, a woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or even write a will without his permission. Her body, her labor, and any children she bore belonged to him. The medieval legal doctrine of coverture held that husband and wife were one person in law, and that person was the husband. This did not mean that all medieval marriages were loveless, or that women had no power within them. Many couples did develop genuine affection for each other over time, and a clever wife could exercise considerable influence over her husband through persuasion and manipulation. But the fundamental inequality of the relationship was built into the very structure of medieval society. For peasants, marriage was somewhat less formal, but no less practical. A peasant couple might marry with only the blessing of their local priest and the consent of their lord, who owned the land they worked. Their wedding would be a simple affair, perhaps just a blessing at the church door followed by a modest feast with family and neighbors. But even among peasants, marriage was primarily an economic arrangement. A young man needed a wife who could help him work his land, bear his children, and manage his household. A young woman needed a husband who could provide for her and protect her in a dangerous world. Love might grow between them, but it was not the foundation of their union. The age at which people married varied considerably depending on their social class and economic circumstances. Among the nobility, girls might be betrothed as young as 7 and married at 12 or 13, as soon as they reached puberty. Boys typically married somewhat later, in their late teens or early 20s. Among peasants, both men and women tended to marry later, often in their mid-20s, after they had accumulated enough resources to establish their own household. These early marriages among the nobility were often not consummated immediately. A girl who was married at 12 might not live with her husband until she was older, remaining with her own family until she was physically mature enough to bear children safely. But the marriage was still legally binding, and it served to cement the alliance between the two families. The church's position on marriage was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the church taught that marriage was a holy sacrament, instituted by God and blessed by Christ at the wedding at Cana. On the other hand, the church also taught that celibacy was a higher calling than marriage, and that sexual desire, even within marriage, was tainted by sin. This ambivalence toward marriage and sexuality created a tension that ran through all of medieval culture. Marriage was necessary for the continuation of society and the legitimization of children, but it was also seen as a concession to human weakness, a way of channeling sinful desires into a socially acceptable form. The ideal Christian life was one of celibacy and devotion to God, not one of earthly love and family. The church did try to regulate marriage and protect women from the worst abuses. It prohibited marriages between close relatives, required the consent of both parties, and forbade divorce except in very limited circumstances. But these rules were often honored more in the breach than in the observance, particularly among the powerful who could afford to ignore or circumvent them. The prohibition on divorce was particularly significant. Once married, a couple was bound together for life, with no possibility of separation except through death or a church annulment. Annulments were theoretically available if the marriage had been contracted improperly, for example, if the couple were too closely related, or if one party had been coerced. But in practice, annulments were expensive and difficult to obtain, available mainly to the wealthy and powerful. This meant that a woman trapped in an abusive or unhappy marriage had no legal recourse. She could not leave her husband, could not divorce him, and could not even live separately from him without his permission. Her only options were to endure or to flee, and fleeing meant abandoning her children, her property, and her place in society. The medieval understanding of love within marriage was very different from modern romantic ideals. Love was not seen as a prerequisite for marriage, but as something that might develop over time through shared experiences and mutual respect. The ideal medieval marriage was one of partnership and cooperation, where husband and wife worked together to manage their household and raise their children. But this partnership was never one of equals. The husband was the head of the household, with legal authority over his wife and children. He made the important decisions, controlled the family's finances, and represented the family in the outside world. The wife's role was to obey her husband, manage the domestic sphere, and bear children. This hierarchy was seen as natural and divinely ordained, part of the proper order of the universe. Despite these constraints, some medieval women did manage to exercise considerable power and influence. A widow, for example, might gain control of her late husband's property and run it herself until her son came of age. A queen or noblewoman might serve as regent for a minor son, wielding political power in his name. And even within the confines of marriage, a clever and determined woman could find ways to shape her own destiny. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For most medieval women, marriage meant a lifetime of subordination to a man they had not chosen, bearing children in an age when childbirth was one of the leading causes of death, and managing a household with limited resources and no legal rights. It was a hard life, and love, if it came at all, was a rare and precious gift. The arranged marriage system did have some advantages from a medieval perspective. It ensured that property stayed within families, that alliances were formed between powerful houses, and that children were born into stable, economically secure households. It also meant that young people did not have to navigate the confusing and often painful process of finding a spouse on their own. But the cost of this system was high. It denied individuals the right to choose their own partners, forced them into relationships they might not want, and created marriages that were often loveless and sometimes abusive. It treated women as property to be bought and sold, and it subordinated personal happiness to family interests. As we look back on medieval marriage from our modern perspective, it is easy to judge it harshly. But we must also remember that medieval people lived in a very different world, one where survival was precarious, life expectancy was short, and individual desires were subordinated to the needs of the family and community. In such a world, arranged marriage made a certain brutal sense, even if it came at a terrible cost to individual freedom and happiness. The system of arranged marriage would persist throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, only gradually giving way to the modern ideal of marriage based on love and mutual choice. But even as the system endured, there were always those who chafed against its restrictions, who dreamed of a different kind of love, and who were willing to risk everything for a chance at happiness. Their stories, whispered in the shadows and sung by troubadours, would help plant the seeds of a romantic revolution that would eventually transform the very nature of love and marriage in the Western world. While arranged marriages governed the practical realities of medieval life, a very different kind of love was being celebrated in the courts and castles of Europe. This was courtly love, a complex and often contradictory code of romantic behavior that would shape Western ideas about romance for centuries to come. It was a love that was passionate yet chaste, devoted yet impossible, and almost always directed towards someone you could never actually marry. The concept of courtly love emerged in the courts of southern France in the late 11th century, particularly in the region of Aquitaine. It was popularized by troubadours, poet-musicians who traveled from court to court singing songs of love and longing. These songs told stories of knights who devoted themselves to noble ladies, performing great deeds in their honor and suffering exquisitely for their love. But here was the paradox at the heart of courtly love. The lady in question was almost always married to someone else. In fact, the very impossibility of the relationship was part of what made it noble and pure. Courtly love was not about consummation or marriage or building a life together. It was about devotion, service, and the refinement of the lover's character through suffering and longing. The rules of courtly love were codified in various medieval texts, most famously in Andreas Capellanus's The Art of Courtly Love, written around 1184. This treatise, which may have been partly satirical, laid out 31 rules that governed the behavior of courtly lovers. These rules were elaborate, specific, and often contradictory, creating a game of love that was as much about performance as genuine emotion. According to these rules, true love could not exist within marriage. This was a radical idea, one that directly contradicted church teaching and social norms. But the logic was clear. Marriage was a practical arrangement based on duty and obligation, while courtly love was a spiritual and emotional connection based on free choice and mutual admiration. The two were fundamentally incompatible. The courtly lover was expected to be utterly devoted to his lady, thinking of her constantly, losing sleep over her, and becoming physically ill from the intensity of his passion. He would perform great deeds to win her favor, fight in tournaments wearing her colors, and compose poetry celebrating her beauty and virtue. But he was also expected to keep his love secret, never revealing the lady's identity and protecting her reputation at all costs. The lady, for her part, was expected to be distant and unattainable, granting small favors to her devoted lover, but never fully reciprocating his passion. She might allow him to kiss her hand, or give him a token to wear in battle, or permit him to gaze upon her from afar. But she must never give herself to him completely, for that would destroy the very nature of courtly love. This dynamic created a relationship that was fundamentally unequal and often frustrating. The lover was a supplicant, begging for crumbs of affection from a lady who held all the power. He had to prove himself worthy through service and suffering, while she remained aloof and judgmental, testing his devotion and finding him wanting. Yet this inequality was seen as ennobling, rather than degrading. By placing himself in service to a noble lady, the knight was supposed to become a better person, more refined, more virtuous, more worthy of her love. His suffering was not meaningless, but transformative, a kind of spiritual discipline that elevated him above ordinary men. The language of courtly love borrowed heavily from religious devotion. The lover worshipped his lady as a knight might worship the Virgin Mary, seeing in her an ideal of feminine perfection that was almost divine. He would kneel before her, pledge his service to her, and dedicate his life to her honor. The parallels to religious devotion were deliberate and obvious. But beneath this spiritual veneer lay a powerful undercurrent of sexual desire. The troubadour's songs were full of erotic imagery, describing the lady's beauty in intimate detail and expressing the lover's physical longing for her. The tension between spiritual devotion and physical desire was part of what made courtly love so compelling and so dangerous. The question of whether courtly love relationships were actually consummated has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue that courtly love was purely platonic, a literary convention that had little to do with real behavior. Others suggest that it was a sophisticated code that allowed nobles to conduct extramarital affairs while maintaining a veneer of respectability. The truth probably varied from case to case. Some courtly love relationships were undoubtedly chaste, existing only in poetry and imagination. Others were almost certainly sexual, with the elaborate rituals of courtly love serving as a cover for adultery. And many probably fell somewhere in between, involving intense emotional intimacy and perhaps some physical contact, but stopping short of full consummation. One of the most famous examples of courtly love was the relationship between the troubadour Geoffrey Rudel and the Countess of Tripoli. According to legend, Rudel fell in love with the Countess based solely on descriptions of her beauty and virtue without ever having met her. He composed songs in her honor and eventually traveled to Tripoli to see her, only to fall ill and die in her arms. It was the ultimate courtly love story, passionate, impossible, and ending in tragedy. Another famous example was the love between Lancelot and Guinevere in the Arthurian legends. Lancelot was the greatest knight of the Round Table, and Guinevere was the wife of King Arthur, Lancelot's lord and friend. Their love was passionate and genuine, but it was also adulterous and ultimately destructive, leading to the downfall of Camelot. The story perfectly captured the tension at the heart of courtly love, the conflict between personal desire and social duty. The practice of courtly love was largely confined to the nobility, who had the leisure time and education to engage in such elaborate romantic games. Peasants, who spent their days working in the fields and struggling to survive, had neither the time nor the inclination for such refined emotions. Their relationships were more straightforward, based on practical considerations and physical attraction rather than elaborate codes of behavior. But even among the nobility, courtly love was more of an ideal than a reality for most people. The elaborate rituals described in troubadour songs and romance literature were aspirational, representing how people thought love should be rather than how it actually was. Real relationships were messier, more complicated, and often less romantic than the idealized versions celebrated in poetry. The rise of courtly love did have some positive effects on the treatment of women, at least among the nobility. By placing women on a pedestal and celebrating their beauty and virtue, courtly love gave them a kind of power and influence they had not previously enjoyed. A lady who was the object of courtly devotion could command the service of knights, influence political decisions, and exercise a degree of agency that was unusual for medieval women. But this power came with significant limitations. The lady of courtly love was idealized and objectified, valued for her beauty and virtue rather than her intelligence or capabilities. She was expected to be passive and distant, a prize to be won rather than an active participant in the relationship. And the power she wielded was always dependent on male desire and approval, making it fragile and conditional. The Church viewed courtly love with deep suspicion. The celebration of adulterous passion, the elevation of earthly love above spiritual devotion, and the implicit challenge to the institution of marriage all ran counter to church teaching. Preachers denounced courtly love as sinful and dangerous, warning that it led to adultery, violence, and damnation. But the church's opposition had limited effect. Courtly love was too popular, too deeply embedded in noble culture, and too useful as a form of entertainment and social bonding to be easily suppressed. The troubadours continued to sing their songs, the romance writers continued to tell their stories, and nobles continued to play the game of courtly love even as they acknowledged its dangers. The legacy of courtly love is complex and contradictory. On one hand, it introduced the idea that love could be a noble and ennobling emotion, worthy of celebration and devotion. It elevated the status of women, at least in theory, and created a cultural space where romantic feelings could be expressed and explored. It laid the groundwork for the modern ideal of romantic love, with its emphasis on passion, devotion, and the free choice of partners. On the other hand, courtly love was fundamentally elitist, available only to the wealthy and educated. It was often hypocritical, celebrating adultery while condemning it, and idealizing women while denying them real power. It created unrealistic expectations about love and relationships that could lead to disappointment and disillusionment, and it was often used to justify and romanticize relationships that were actually exploitative or abusive. The rituals of courtly love could be elaborate and time-consuming. A knight might spend years in service to his lady, performing deeds of valor and composing poetry in her honor, all for the hope of a single kind word or a fleeting smile. He might wear her colors in tournaments, fight duels in her name, and dedicate his victories to her glory. Every aspect of his life would be oriented toward winning her favor. The lady, meanwhile, had to navigate a delicate balance. She needed to encourage her admirer enough to keep him devoted, but not so much that she compromised her reputation or gave him false hope. She had to accept his service and his gifts while maintaining her distance and her virtue. It was a performance that required considerable skill and self-control. The exchange of tokens was an important part of courtly love ritual. A lady might give her devoted knight a ribbon, a glove, or a lock of her hair to wear as a favor. He would treasure this token, carrying it into battle and kissing it before he slept. The token was a symbol of the lady's favor and a reminder of the knight's devotion, a physical link between them, even when they were apart. Letters were another important means of communication between courtly lovers. These letters were often highly stylized, following elaborate conventions of language and form. They would be full of classical allusions, poetic metaphors, and protestations of undying devotion. The act of writing and receiving these letters was itself a form of courtship, a way of building intimacy through words when physical intimacy was forbidden. The concept of the love test was also central to courtly love. The lady would set challenges for her knight, testing his devotion and his worthiness. She might ask him to perform a dangerous deed, to wait for her for a certain period of time, or to prove his love in some other way. These tests were meant to separate true lovers from mere pretenders, ensuring that only the most devoted and worthy knights won the lady's favor. Music played a crucial role in the culture of courtly love. The troubadours were not just poets but musicians, and their songs were meant to be performed with instrumental accompaniment. The melodies were often haunting and melancholic, reflecting the bittersweet nature of courtly love. These songs would be performed at feasts and gatherings, creating a shared cultural experience that reinforced the ideals of courtly love. The influence of courtly love extended beyond the courts of France to England, Germany, Italy, and other parts of Europe. Each region developed its own variations on the theme, adapting the basic concepts to local customs and sensibilities. In Germany, the Minnesingers sang of love and devotion in a tradition that paralleled the French troubadours. In Italy, poets like Dante and Petrarch would transform courtly love into a more spiritual and philosophical form. Dante's love for Beatrice, whom he first saw when he was 9 years old and she was 8, became the inspiration for his greatest works. He saw her only a few times in his life and never spoke to her, yet she became his muse and his guide through paradise in the Divine Comedy. This was courtly love taken to its most extreme and spiritual form, where the beloved becomes a symbol of divine grace and a path to salvation. Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, a married woman he claimed to have seen in a church in Avignon, established a poetic tradition that would influence European literature for centuries. His poems expressed the pain and joy of unrequited love, the beauty of the beloved, and the ennobling effect of devotion. Like Dante, Petrarch transformed courtly love from a social game into a profound spiritual and artistic experience. The literature of courtly love was not limited to poetry. Romance narratives, long prose or verse stories of knights and their adventures became increasingly popular in the 12th and 13th centuries. These romances told elaborate stories of love, adventure, and moral testing, often set in the world of King Arthur and the Round Table. The most famous of these romances was probably Chrétien de Troyes' Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, which told the story of Lancelot's love for Queen Guinevere. The romance depicted Lancelot as the perfect courtly lover, willing to endure any humiliation or hardship for his lady's sake. At one point he even rides in a cart, a vehicle associated with criminals and the lowest classes, because it is the only way to pursue Guinevere's kidnappers. His willingness to sacrifice his honor for love was presented as the ultimate proof of his devotion. These romances were not just entertainment, but moral instruction, teaching young nobles how they should behave and what values they should uphold. They presented idealized versions of knightly conduct where courage, loyalty, and devotion to one's lady were the highest virtues. They also explored the tensions and contradictions inherent in the chivalric code, particularly the conflict between loyalty to one's lord and devotion to one's lady. The courts where courtly love flourished were often presided over by powerful women who served as patrons of the arts and arbiters of taste. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, was a great patron of troubadours and is often credited with spreading the culture of courtly love from southern France to England and beyond. Her daughter, Marie de Champagne, presided over a court that was famous for its literary and artistic sophistication. These women used their patronage to shape the culture of courtly love in ways that gave them power and influence. By setting themselves up as judges of proper courtly behavior, they could reward knights who pleased them and punish those who did not. They could use the language and rituals of courtly love to build networks of loyalty and obligation that enhanced their political power. But we must be careful not to romanticize this too much. Even the most powerful women of the Middle Ages operated within severe constraints. They could not inherit property in their own right in most cases, could not hold political office, and were always subject to the authority of fathers, husbands, or sons. The power they wielded through courtly love was real but limited, and it could be taken away at any moment. The practice of courtly love also had a dark side that is often overlooked in romantic accounts. The intense focus on a single beloved could become obsessive and unhealthy. Knights who were rejected by their ladies sometimes became violent or suicidal. The idealization of women could flip into misogyny when real women failed to live up to impossible standards. And the celebration of adulterous passion could destroy marriages and families. There were also questions about consent and power dynamics in courtly love relationships. When a powerful knight declared his devotion to a lady, was she really free to reject him? When a lord's wife became the object of a knight's affection, could she safely refuse his advances without creating political complications? The elaborate rituals of courtly love could mask relationships that were actually coercive or exploitative. Despite these problems, courtly love represented a significant shift in how Europeans thought about romantic relationships. For the first time, love was being celebrated as a valuable emotion in its own right, not just as a means to an end. The idea that one could choose one's beloved based on personal attraction and emotional connection, rather than family arrangement and economic advantage, was revolutionary, even if it was only realized in fantasy and literature. The tension between courtly love and arranged marriage created a fundamental contradiction in medieval culture. On one hand, people were taught that marriage was a practical arrangement that had nothing to do with love. On the other hand, they were exposed to stories and songs that celebrated passionate, all-consuming love as the highest human experience. This contradiction would not be resolved until much later, when the ideal of companionate marriage based on love and mutual choice began to emerge. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval love, we will see how these contradictions played out in real lives, how people navigated between duty and desire, and how the seeds planted by courtly love would eventually grow into the modern romantic ideal. But for now, we must turn our attention to another aspect of medieval love, the role of the church in regulating and controlling sexual behavior. If courtly love represented the romantic ideal of medieval society, the church represented its moral reality. And that reality was harsh, unforgiving, and deeply suspicious of any form of sexual pleasure. The medieval church did not just regulate marriage, it sought to control every aspect of human sexuality, from the thoughts in your head to the actions in your bed, and it did so with a thoroughness and intrusiveness that would be unthinkable today. The church's attitude towards sex was shaped by the writings of early Christian theologians, particularly St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, who had lived a dissolute youth before his conversion, came to see sexual desire as the primary manifestation of original sin. He taught that sex was inherently sinful, even within marriage, and that it could only be justified if it was performed solely for the purpose of procreation. This meant that any sexual act that could not result in pregnancy was considered gravely sinful. Contraception, oral sex, anal sex, and even certain positions during intercourse were all forbidden. The only acceptable form of sex was vaginal intercourse in the missionary position, performed without pleasure or passion, solely for the purpose of creating children. Any deviation from this narrow standard was a mortal sin that could damn your soul to hell. But the Church's regulation of sexuality went far beyond just prohibiting certain acts. It also sought to control when and how often married couples could have sex. There were numerous days throughout the year when sexual intercourse was forbidden, even between husband and wife. These included Sundays, holy days, fast days, and the entire seasons of Advent and Lent. According to some calculations, when you added up all the forbidden days, married couples were only supposed to have sex on about 44 days per year, and even on those permitted days, sex was supposed to be performed quickly, without foreplay or pleasure, and only in the dark. The idea that sex could be enjoyable, even within marriage, was seen as dangerous and sinful. The Church also regulated who could marry whom through an elaborate system of prohibited degrees of relationship. You could not marry anyone related to you by blood or marriage up to the 7th degree, which meant that you could not marry anyone who shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent with you. This made it very difficult to find a suitable spouse, particularly in small communities where everyone was related to everyone else. These rules were not just theoretical. The church had an elaborate system for enforcing them, centered on the sacrament of confession. Every Christian was required to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, and sexual sins were a major focus of these confessions. Priests were given detailed manuals that instructed them on what questions to ask and how to determine the severity of different sexual sins. These confession manuals, known as penitentials, are fascinating and disturbing documents. They list hundreds of different sexual acts and assign specific penances for each one. The penances could range from a few days of fasting for minor sins to years of exclusion from communion for major ones. Some of the acts described in these manuals are so specific and unusual that one wonders how the priests even knew to ask about them. The questions priests were instructed to ask during confession were incredibly intrusive. They would ask married couples about the frequency of their sexual relations, the positions they used, whether they experienced pleasure, and whether they had used any form of contraception. They would ask unmarried people about masturbation, sexual fantasies, and any sexual contact with others. Nothing was too private or too personal to escape the church's scrutiny. For women, the church's regulation of sexuality was particularly oppressive. Women were seen as inherently more sexual and less rational than men, more likely to be tempted by lust and to lead men into sin. The story of Eve tempting Adam in the Garden of Eden was used to justify this view, and women were constantly warned about the dangers of their own sexuality. Young women were expected to remain virgins until marriage, and their virginity was seen as their most valuable asset. A woman who lost her virginity before marriage was considered damaged goods, unmarriageable and shameful. The emphasis on female virginity was so strong that some women who had been raped were blamed for their own assault, accused of having tempted their attackers or of not resisting strongly enough. Within marriage, women were expected to submit to their husband's sexual demands, even if they found them unpleasant or painful. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law. A husband had the right to his wife's body, and she had no right to refuse him. At the same time, women were warned not to enjoy sex too much, as excessive pleasure was seen as sinful and unfeminine. The church's obsession with controlling sexuality extended to the regulation of prostitution. Prostitution was technically sinful, but it was also seen as a necessary evil, a way of channeling male lust that might otherwise lead to worse sins like adultery or rape. Many medieval cities had licensed brothels that were regulated by the authorities and sometimes even owned by the church itself. This pragmatic approach to prostitution reflected the church's deeply pessimistic view of human nature. Men were seen as naturally lustful and unable to control their desires, so it was better to provide them with an outlet that would not threaten the social order. Prostitutes were despised and marginalized, but they were also tolerated as a necessary part of society. The penalties for sexual sins could be severe. Adultery was not just a sin but a crime, punishable by public humiliation, fines, or even death in some cases. A woman convicted of adultery might be forced to walk through the streets wearing only a shift, or to stand in the pillory while the townspeople pelted her with rotten vegetables. In extreme cases, she might be executed, though this was rare. Homosexuality was considered one of the worst sexual sins, often grouped with heresy and witchcraft as crimes against nature and God. The penalties for homosexual acts could include burning at the stake, though in practice such extreme punishments were relatively rare. More commonly, people accused of homosexuality would be subjected to public humiliation, fines, or imprisonment. The Church's attitude toward homosexuality was not consistent throughout the Middle Ages. In the early medieval period, there seems to have been more tolerance for same-sex relationships, at least among the clergy. Some monasteries and convents were known for having romantic friendships between members that may have been sexual in nature. But by the later Middle Ages, the Church had become much more hostile to homosexuality, seeing it as a threat to the social and moral order. The regulation of sexuality was not just about controlling behavior, it was also about controlling knowledge. The Church sought to limit what people knew about sex and reproduction, fearing that too much knowledge would lead to sin. Medical texts that discussed sexual anatomy or contraception were often censored or banned. Midwives, who had practical knowledge about women's bodies and reproduction, were viewed with suspicion and sometimes accused of witchcraft. This ignorance had serious consequences. Many people entered marriage with little or no understanding of sex or reproduction. Young brides might be terrified on their wedding night, having no idea what to expect. Couples might struggle with infertility because they did not understand the basics of conception. And women might die in childbirth because midwives lacked the knowledge to help them. The Church's teaching on contraception was particularly problematic. Any attempt to prevent pregnancy was considered a grave sin, equivalent to murder. This meant that women had no control over how many children they would bear, even if repeated pregnancies were destroying their health. A woman might have 10 or 15 pregnancies in her lifetime, with many of those children dying in infancy or childhood. The only acceptable form of family planning was abstinence, but this was difficult to practice in a society where women had no right to refuse their husbands' sexual demands. Some couples tried to use the rhythm method, avoiding sex during what they believed were the woman's fertile days, but medieval understanding of the female reproductive cycle was so poor that this method was largely ineffective. The Church did recognize that some marriages were so unhappy or abusive that they should not continue. But divorce, in the modern sense of dissolving a valid marriage, was not permitted. The only option was an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Annulments were difficult to obtain and required proving that there had been some impediment to the marriage from the beginning. The most common grounds for annulment were consanguinity, being too closely related, impotence, or coercion. But proving these grounds could be difficult and humiliating. A man seeking an annulment on grounds of his wife's infidelity would have to provide witnesses and evidence. A woman seeking an annulment on grounds of her husband's impotence might have to submit to an examination by a panel of matrons who would determine whether she was still a virgin. Wealthy and powerful people could often obtain annulments more easily than ordinary folk, either by discovering some previously unknown relationship between the spouses or by bribing church officials. King Henry VIII of England would later make this practice infamous by seeking an annulment from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn, eventually breaking with the Catholic Church when the Pope refused to grant it. For ordinary people trapped in unhappy marriages, there was little recourse. Some simply separated informally, with one spouse leaving to live elsewhere. But this was risky, as it left both parties in a kind of legal limbo, unable to remarry and vulnerable to accusations of adultery if they formed new relationships. Others endured their marriages in misery, finding what comfort they could in work, children, or religion. The Church's control over marriage and sexuality was not absolute, of course. People found ways to evade or circumvent the rules, and enforcement was often lax, particularly in rural areas far from church authorities. But the psychological and social power of the Church was immense, and most people internalized its teachings to some degree, even if they did not always follow them in practice. The concept of sin and guilt was central to the Church's control over sexuality. People were taught from childhood that sexual thoughts and desires were sinful, that their bodies were sources of temptation and shame. This created a culture of sexual repression and anxiety that affected every aspect of medieval life. Even married couples who were following all the Church's rules might feel guilty about experiencing pleasure during sex. The Church's teaching on sexuality was not entirely negative, however. It did provide some protections for women, particularly in the area of marriage. The requirement that both parties consent to a marriage gave women at least a theoretical right to refuse unwanted matches. The prohibition on divorce meant that a husband could not simply cast off his wife when he tired of her. And the Church's teaching that sex should be for procreation rather than pleasure meant that women could not be blamed for not being sexually enthusiastic. But these protections were limited and often more theoretical than real. A young woman who refused a marriage her father had arranged might face severe social and economic consequences. A wife who was cast off by her husband might find that the Church was unwilling or unable to enforce her rights, and the teaching that sex was primarily for procreation did nothing to protect women from the physical dangers of repeated pregnancies and childbirth. The Church's regulation of sexuality also had unintended consequences. By making sex so forbidden and shameful, it may have actually increased people's obsession with it. The elaborate rules and prohibitions created a culture where sex was constantly discussed, debated, and worried about, even as it was officially condemned. The very act of confessing sexual sins in detail to a priest may have had the effect of keeping those sins vividly in mind. The medieval church's approach to sexuality was shaped by a particular historical and theological context, one that saw the body as inferior to the soul and earthly pleasures as obstacles to salvation. This worldview made sense in a society that was deeply religious and where life was often short and brutal. But it also created enormous suffering, particularly for women, and it established patterns of sexual repression and guilt that would persist long after the Middle Ages ended. As we continue our exploration of medieval love, we will see how people navigated between the Church's strict rules and their own desires, how they found ways to express love and passion within the constraints of their society, and how the seeds of rebellion against church authority were planted. But first, we must examine another crucial aspect of medieval love: the role of family and community in regulating relationships. In the medieval world, privacy was a luxury that few could afford. Most people lived in small, tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Your neighbors knew when you woke up, what you ate for breakfast, who visited your house, and what time you went to bed. And they were watching, always watching, ready to judge, gossip, and report any behavior that violated community norms. This lack of privacy had profound implications for romantic and sexual relationships. A young couple could not simply meet in secret or conduct a clandestine affair without the entire village knowing about it. Every glance, every conversation, every moment spent together was observed and interpreted by dozens of watchful eyes. The community was a powerful force for enforcing social norms, and those who violated those norms faced swift and severe consequences. The physical layout of medieval villages and towns made privacy nearly impossible. Most peasants lived in small one-room houses where the entire family slept together, often sharing the space with livestock. There were no separate bedrooms, no locked doors, no private spaces where a couple could be alone. Even among the wealthy, who had larger houses with multiple rooms, servants were constantly present, and walls were thin. This meant that the most intimate moments of life were conducted in the presence of others. Couples made love while their children slept a few feet away. Women gave birth surrounded by neighbors and relatives. The sick and dying were attended by the entire household. There was no such thing as a private moment, no escape from the constant presence of others. The lack of physical privacy was reinforced by social customs that encouraged surveillance and gossip. Neighbors felt it was their duty to watch each other and report any suspicious or immoral behavior. A woman who received male visitors when her husband was away would quickly become the subject of gossip. A young couple who spent too much time alone together would be warned by their elders. The community acted as a kind of informal police force, enforcing moral standards through social pressure. This surveillance was particularly intense when it came to young, unmarried people. Parents, relatives, and neighbors all worked together to ensure that young men and women did not have opportunities for sexual contact before marriage. Young women were especially closely watched, as their virginity was seen as crucial to their marriageability and their family's honor. Courtship, such as it was, had to be conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones. A young man who wanted to court a young woman would have to visit her at her family's home, where her parents and siblings would be present. The couple might be allowed to talk, but always within sight and hearing of others. Any attempt to be alone together would be immediately noticed and prevented. In some communities, there were designated times and places where young people could socialize under supervision. Village dances, church gatherings, and seasonal festivals provided opportunities for young men and women to meet and interact, but always in public and always under the watchful eyes of their elders. These events were carefully structured to allow some social mixing while preventing any improper behavior. The community also played a crucial role in the formation and recognition of marriages. In many cases, particularly among peasants, a couple might consider themselves married simply by publicly declaring their intention to live together as husband and wife. This was known as a handfasting, or common law marriage, and it was recognized as valid by both the community and, initially, by the church. But for such a marriage to be accepted, it had to be public and witnessed by the community. A couple could not simply run off together and claim to be married. They had to make their union known to their neighbors and gain their acceptance. The community's recognition was what made the marriage real and legitimate, more so than any religious ceremony or legal document. This public nature of marriage meant that the community also had a say in whether a particular match was appropriate. If a couple's marriage violated community norms, for example, if they were too closely related, or if one of them was already married to someone else, the community could refuse to recognize the union and pressure the couple to separate. The community also enforced sexual norms through public shaming rituals. These rituals, which varied from place to place, were designed to humiliate those who had violated sexual morality and to reinforce community standards. One common ritual was the charivari, or rough music, in which the community would gather outside the home of someone who had committed a sexual transgression and make loud, discordant noise with pots, pans, and musical instruments. The charivari might be directed at a couple who had married despite a large age difference, a widow who had remarried too quickly after her husband's death, or a man who was known to beat his wife. The noise would continue for hours or even days, making it impossible for the targets to sleep or go about their normal activities. The ritual was meant to shame them into conforming to community expectations, or, in some cases, to drive them out of the community altogether. Another form of public shaming was the cucking stool, or ducking stool, a chair attached to a long pole that was used to dunk women accused of being scolds, gossips, or adulteresses into a river or pond. The woman would be strapped into the chair and repeatedly dunked while the community watched and jeered. It was a humiliating and sometimes dangerous punishment that reinforced the community's power to enforce moral standards. For women accused of sexual misconduct, the punishments could be even more severe. A woman convicted of adultery might be forced to walk through the streets wearing only a white sheet, or to stand in the pillory while the townspeople pelted her with rotten vegetables and excrement. Her head might be shaved, or she might be branded with a letter indicating her crime. These public humiliations were designed not just to punish the individual, but to serve as a warning to others. Men who committed sexual transgressions were also subject to public shaming, though often less severely than women. A man who fathered a child out of wedlock might be forced to marry the mother or to pay for the child's support. A man who committed adultery might be fined or forced to do public penance. But in general, men faced less severe consequences for sexual misconduct than women did, reflecting the double standard that pervaded medieval society. The community's role in regulating sexuality extended to the enforcement of marriage itself. If a man abandoned his wife or failed to provide for her, the community might pressure him to return or to send money. If a couple's marriage was so troubled that they could not live together peacefully, the community might intervene to mediate their disputes or to arrange a separation. In some cases, the community would take collective action to punish those who violated sexual norms. A man who was known to be having an affair with a married woman might find his crops destroyed or his livestock killed. A woman who was suspected of prostitution might be driven out of the village. These informal punishments were often more effective than legal sanctions, as they carried the weight of community disapproval and could make it impossible for the offender to continue living in the community. The power of community surveillance and enforcement was not absolute, of course. People did find ways to conduct secret affairs, to meet in hidden places, and to evade the watchful eyes of their neighbors. The very intensity of the surveillance suggests that people were constantly trying to circumvent it. But the risk of discovery was always present, and the consequences of being caught could be devastating. For young people trying to navigate the path to marriage, the community's involvement could be both helpful and oppressive. On one hand, the community provided a structure and a set of expectations that made the process of finding a spouse more predictable. Young people knew what was expected of them, and they had the support and guidance of their elders. On the other hand, the community's expectations could be stifling, leaving little room for individual choice or romantic love. The community also played a role in protecting young women from sexual exploitation. If a man seduced a young woman with promises of marriage and then abandoned her, the community might pressure him to make good on his promise or to provide compensation. If a man raped a woman, the community might take action against him, even if the legal authorities did not. This community justice was rough and imperfect, but it provided some protection in a world where women had few legal rights. The role of gossip in medieval communities cannot be overstated. Gossip was not just idle chatter. It was a powerful tool for enforcing social norms and maintaining community cohesion. Through gossip, information about people's behavior spread quickly throughout the community, and reputations were made or destroyed. A woman who was the subject of sexual gossip might find it impossible to make a good marriage. A man who was gossiped about as a poor provider might lose the respect of his neighbors. Women were often the primary agents of gossip, as they spent much of their time in close proximity to each other, working together at tasks like spinning, weaving, and food preparation. These work sessions were opportunities for women to share information, discuss their neighbors' behavior, and collectively enforce moral standards. The power of female gossip was recognized and feared by men, who often tried to control it through laws against scolding and gossiping. But gossip was not just a tool of social control. It was also a form of entertainment and a way of building social bonds. In a world without mass media or other forms of entertainment, gossip provided a way to pass the time and to feel connected to the larger community. Stories about other people's romantic entanglements, sexual misadventures, and marital troubles were endlessly fascinating, providing both moral lessons and vicarious thrills. The community's involvement in regulating love and sexuality was not always negative. In many cases, the community provided support and assistance to couples who were struggling. Neighbors might help a young couple set up their household, providing furniture, tools, and advice. They might intervene in marital disputes, helping couples to resolve their differences and stay together. They might care for children when parents were sick or unable to provide for them. The community also provided a social safety net for those who fell on hard times. A widow might be taken in by relatives or neighbors. An abandoned wife might receive support from the community until her husband returned or she could remarry. Orphaned children might be raised by the community collectively. This mutual support was essential in a world where there were no government welfare programs or social services, but the price of this support was conformity. To receive the community's help, you had to follow its rules and accept its judgments. Those who defied community norms or who were seen as outsiders might find themselves excluded from this support system, left to fend for themselves in a harsh and unforgiving world. The tension between individual desire and community expectations was a constant feature of medieval life. People wanted to choose their own partners, to follow their own hearts, and to live their lives as they saw fit. But the community demanded conformity, obedience, and adherence to traditional norms. This tension could not be resolved, only managed, and it created a constant undercurrent of conflict and resentment. As we continue our exploration of medieval love, we will see how this tension played out in individual lives, how people found ways to assert their own desires within the constraints of community expectations, and how the seeds of individualism and personal freedom were planted. But first, we must examine one of the most controversial aspects of medieval sexuality, the practice of concubinage and the existence of illegitimate children. Behind the respectable facade of medieval marriage lay a hidden world of concubines, mistresses, and illegitimate children. These shadow families existed in the margins of society, neither fully acknowledged nor entirely hidden, tolerated but not accepted. They were the dirty secret of medieval life, the evidence that the Church's strict rules about sexuality were honored more in the breach than in the observance. Concubinage, the practice of a man keeping a woman as a long-term sexual partner without marrying her, was widespread throughout the Middle Ages. It was particularly common among the clergy, who were supposed to be celibate but often were not. Many priests, bishops, and even popes kept concubines, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. These relationships were technically sinful and illegal, but they were so common that they were often tacitly accepted by the community. The reasons for clerical concubinage were complex. The Church's requirement of celibacy for priests was relatively new in the early Middle Ages and was not universally accepted or enforced. Many priests had been married before the celibacy requirement was imposed, and they simply continued to live with their wives, now called concubines. Others entered into relationships after becoming priests, unable or unwilling to live without female companionship and sexual release. The church periodically launched campaigns to enforce clerical celibacy and to drive out priests' concubines, but these campaigns were rarely successful. The women would be expelled from the priest's house, only to return a few weeks or months later. The priest would be fined or suspended, only to resume his relationship once the authorities' attention had moved elsewhere. The gap between the church's official teaching and actual practice was enormous. Lay concubinage was also common, particularly among the wealthy and powerful. A nobleman might keep a mistress in addition to his wife, setting her up in a separate household and visiting her regularly. A merchant might have a long-term relationship with a woman who was not his wife, perhaps because his wife was unable to have children, or because he had fallen in love with someone else after his marriage was arranged. These relationships were different from casual affairs or visits to prostitutes. A concubine was a long-term partner, often living with the man, or in a household he provided for her. She might bear his children, manage his household, and provide him with companionship and emotional support. In many ways, she functioned as a wife, except that the relationship lacked legal recognition and social respectability. The status of concubines varied considerably depending on the circumstances. Some were women of relatively high social status who had entered into the relationship voluntarily, perhaps because they could not marry the man they loved, or because they preferred the relative independence of concubinage to the legal subordination of marriage. Others were servants or women of lower social status who had little choice in the matter, essentially coerced into the relationship by their employer or master. The children born of these relationships were illegitimate, or bastards in the harsh language of the time. Illegitimacy carried a severe social stigma and had serious legal consequences. Illegitimate children could not inherit their father's property or title, could not hold certain offices, and were often excluded from guilds and other organizations. They were marked from birth as inferior, the products of sin and shame. But the reality was more complicated than the legal status suggests. Many fathers acknowledged their illegitimate children and provided for them, sometimes generously. A nobleman might arrange good marriages for his illegitimate daughters or find positions in the church or military for his illegitimate sons. Some illegitimate children rose to positions of great power and influence, their birth status overcome by their abilities and their father's support. The most famous example of a successful illegitimate child was probably William the Conqueror, who was born to Robert, Duke of Normandy, and his concubine Herleva. William's illegitimacy was well known. His enemies called him William the Bastard, but it did not prevent him from inheriting his father's duchy or from conquering England in 1066. His success showed that illegitimacy, while a disadvantage, was not an insurmountable barrier to achievement. The church's attitude toward illegitimate children was harsh, but not entirely unforgiving. Illegitimate children could be legitimized through the subsequent marriage of their parents, a process that removed the legal disabilities of bastardy. They could also receive dispensations from the church that allowed them to hold offices or inherit property despite their illegitimate birth. These dispensations were expensive and difficult to obtain, but they were available to those who could afford them. For the mothers of illegitimate children, the situation was often desperate. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock faced social ostracism, economic hardship, and the very real possibility of being unable to marry or support herself. If the father of her child was wealthy and acknowledged paternity, she might receive some support, but if he denied the child was his, or if he was unable or unwilling to provide for her, she might be left destitute. Some women who found themselves pregnant out of wedlock tried to hide their condition and dispose of the baby after birth. Infanticide was not uncommon in the Middle Ages, though it was considered murder and was punishable by death if discovered. Other women abandoned their babies at churches or monasteries, hoping that the religious institutions would care for them. Many of these abandoned children died, but some survived and were raised by the church or by foster families. The existence of illegitimate children created complex family dynamics. A man's legitimate wife might have to tolerate the presence of his concubine and illegitimate children, knowing that she had no legal recourse to prevent the relationship. The legitimate children might grow up alongside their illegitimate half-siblings, sometimes forming close bonds, sometimes viewing them as rivals for their father's affection and resources. In some cases, illegitimate children were brought into the father's household and raised alongside his legitimate children. This was particularly common if the father's wife was unable to have children, or if all his legitimate children had died. An illegitimate son might be groomed to take over the family business or estate, even though he could not legally inherit. An illegitimate daughter might be married off to a suitable husband, with her father providing a dowry. The practice of concubinage and the existence of illegitimate children reveal the gap between medieval ideals and medieval realities. The Church taught that sex should only occur within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation. Society taught that family honor and legitimacy were paramount. But in practice, many people engaged in extramarital relationships, and many children were born outside of marriage. This gap between ideal and reality created a kind of cognitive dissonance in medieval culture. People knew that concubinage and illegitimacy were wrong, but they also knew that they were common and often tolerated. This created a culture of hypocrisy, where people publicly condemned behaviors that they privately engaged in or accepted. The existence of shadow families also highlights the limited options available to medieval women. A woman who became a concubine might have done so because she had no other way to support herself, because she had been seduced or coerced, or because she genuinely loved the man and wanted to be with him even though marriage was impossible. Whatever her reasons, her choice to enter into such a relationship marked her as morally suspect and socially marginal. For some women, concubinage offered a degree of freedom and autonomy that marriage did not. A concubine was not legally subject to her partner in the way that a wife was subject to her husband. She could own property, make contracts, and leave the relationship if she chose, though doing so might mean losing her livelihood and social position. Some women preferred this precarious independence to the legal subordination of marriage. The children of these relationships often occupied an ambiguous social position. They were neither fully inside nor fully outside the family, neither fully legitimate nor entirely outcast. Their status depended largely on their father's willingness to acknowledge and support them, and on the tolerance of his legitimate family. Some illegitimate children were loved and accepted. Others were resented and excluded. The medieval legal system struggled to deal with the reality of illegitimacy. On one hand, the law sought to protect the rights of legitimate heirs and to discourage extramarital relationships by penalizing illegitimate children. On the other hand, the law recognized that illegitimate children were innocent of their parents' sins and deserved some protection and support. This tension was never fully resolved. In some regions, illegitimate children had limited inheritance rights, particularly if their father had no legitimate heirs. In others, they were completely excluded from inheritance, even if their father acknowledged them and wanted to provide for them. The rules varied from place to place and changed over time, creating a complex and often contradictory legal landscape. The existence of illegitimate children also created opportunities for fraud and deception. A man might claim that a child was his legitimate heir, when in fact the child was illegitimate, or vice versa. A woman might claim that a wealthy man was the father of her child in hopes of receiving support, even if the claim was false. These disputes could lead to lengthy legal battles and could tear families apart. The Church's role in regulating illegitimacy was complicated by its own involvement in the practice. Many church officials kept concubines and fathered illegitimate children, even as they preached against sexual sin and enforced penalties for illegitimacy. This hypocrisy undermined the Church's moral authority and contributed to growing criticism of clerical corruption. By the later Middle Ages, there was increasing pressure to reform the Church and to enforce clerical celibacy more strictly. The Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, was partly motivated by anger at clerical corruption and hypocrisy, including the widespread practice of clerical concubinage. The Reformers argued that priests should be allowed to marry rather than being forced into celibacy and then breaking their vows. The Catholic Church responded to these criticisms with the Counter-Reformation, which included stricter enforcement of clerical celibacy and efforts to eliminate concubinage. But the practice persisted in some areas well into the modern era, a testament to the difficulty of enforcing rules that go against human nature and social reality. The story of shadow families in the Middle Ages is ultimately a story about the limits of social control and the persistence of human desire. No matter how strict the rules, no matter how severe the penalties, people continued to form relationships outside of marriage, to have children out of wedlock, and to create families that did not fit the approved model. These shadow families were a constant reminder that love and sexuality could not be fully controlled by church or society, no matter how hard they tried. As we continue our exploration of medieval love, we will see how these tensions and contradictions played out in other areas of life, how people found ways to express their desires and form relationships despite the obstacles, and how the medieval understanding of love gradually evolved toward something closer to our modern ideals. But first, we must examine one of the most tragic aspects of medieval love, the fate of those who loved in ways that society could not accept. Not all love in the Middle Ages fit neatly into the categories of marriage, courtly devotion, or even concubinage. Some people loved in ways that medieval society considered not just sinful but unnatural, abominable, and deserving of the harshest punishment. These were the people who loved members of their own sex, who desired those they were forbidden to desire, and who had to hide their true feelings from a world that would destroy them if it knew. The medieval attitude toward same-sex love was complex and contradictory. On one hand, the Church condemned homosexual acts as among the worst of sins, often grouping them with heresy and witchcraft as crimes against nature. The biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah was frequently cited as evidence of God's wrath against such behavior. Theologians argued that homosexual acts were unnatural because they could not result in procreation, the only legitimate purpose of sexual activity. On the other hand, the reality of same-sex desire and relationships in medieval society was more complicated than the official condemnation suggests. There is considerable evidence that romantic and possibly sexual relationships between people of the same sex were not uncommon, particularly in certain contexts like monasteries, convents, and the military. These relationships existed in a kind of gray area, neither fully acknowledged nor entirely hidden. The language that medieval people used to describe same-sex relationships was often ambiguous. Close friendships between men were celebrated and encouraged, and the language used to describe these friendships could be intensely emotional and even erotic. Men would write to each other in terms that sound romantic to modern ears, declaring their love, their devotion, and their desire to be together. But it is often impossible to know whether these relationships were sexual or whether they were simply expressing the kind of intense emotional bond that was acceptable between friends. The same ambiguity existed in relationships between women. Nuns would write to each other in passionate terms, describing their love and longing. Women would form intense emotional bonds that lasted for years or even lifetimes. But again, it is difficult to know whether these relationships were sexual or whether they were simply expressing a kind of emotional intimacy that was more acceptable between women than it would have been between men and women. The medieval concept of sexuality was different from our modern understanding. Medieval people did not think in terms of sexual orientation or identity. There was no concept of being gay or straight as an inherent part of one's identity. Instead, sexual acts were categorized as either natural, those that could lead to procreation, or unnatural, those that could not. A person who engaged in homosexual acts was not seen as a different kind of person, but simply as someone who was committing a particular kind of sin. This meant that same-sex desire was seen as a temptation that anyone might experience, not as a defining characteristic of certain individuals. The Church taught that everyone was capable of any sin, and that the key was to resist temptation and avoid sinful acts. A person who experienced same-sex attraction was not necessarily condemned as long as they did not act on those feelings. In practice, the enforcement of laws against homosexual acts was inconsistent and often depended on social status and context. Wealthy and powerful people who engaged in same-sex relationships might face little or no punishment, while poor or marginal people might be severely punished for the same behavior. The laws were often used selectively, as a way of attacking political enemies or scapegoating unpopular individuals. The penalties for homosexual acts, when they were enforced, could be severe. In some regions and time periods, the punishment was death, often by burning at the stake. In others, the punishment might be public humiliation, fines, or imprisonment. But actual prosecutions were relatively rare, suggesting that many same-sex relationships went undetected, or were tolerated as long as they were kept discreet. Monasteries and convents, which were supposed to be places of celibacy and spiritual devotion, were often sites of same-sex relationships. The close living quarters, the emotional intensity of religious life, and the absence of the opposite sex created conditions where same-sex bonds could flourish. Some of these relationships were undoubtedly chaste, but others were almost certainly sexual. The Church was aware of this problem and tried to address it through various means. Monastic rules often included provisions designed to prevent particular friendships between monks or nuns, requiring that they sleep in dormitories rather than private cells, that they not be alone together, and that they not show excessive affection for each other. But these rules were difficult to enforce, and same-sex relationships continued to exist in religious communities throughout the Middle Ages. One of the most famous examples of a possible same-sex relationship in the Middle Ages is that between King Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, and King Philip II of France. Contemporary chroniclers describe the two kings as being extremely close, even sharing a bed when they were together. Some historians have interpreted this as evidence of a sexual relationship, while others argue that it was simply a close friendship expressed in the language and customs of the time. The ambiguity of such relationships makes it difficult for historians to draw firm conclusions about the prevalence and nature of same-sex love in the Middle Ages. The evidence is fragmentary, often coded or ambiguous, and filtered through the lens of people who were hostile to such relationships. But the evidence that does exist suggests that same-sex desire and relationships were a part of medieval life, even if they had to be hidden or disguised. Women who loved women faced particular challenges in medieval society. Because women were expected to be passive and lacking in sexual desire, female same-sex relationships were often not taken as seriously as male ones. There was a sense that women could not really have sex with each other because sex required a penis. This meant that relationships between women might be overlooked or dismissed as harmless, even when they were clearly romantic or sexual in nature. But this relative invisibility was a double-edged sword. While it might mean that women who loved women faced less severe punishment than men who loved men, it also meant that their relationships were not recognized or validated. They existed in a kind of limbo, neither fully condemned nor fully acknowledged. Some women found ways to live together and form long-term partnerships that functioned much like marriages. They might present themselves as sisters or as a mistress and her servant, using these socially acceptable relationships as a cover for their romantic bond. Others might enter convents together, where they could live in close proximity and form intense emotional bonds without arousing suspicion. The medieval understanding of gender was also more fluid than we might expect. There are numerous accounts of women who dressed as men and lived as men for years or even decades, sometimes marrying other women and only being discovered after their death. These individuals, whom we might today describe as transgender, were able to navigate medieval society by adopting a male identity, though they faced severe punishment if their biological sex was discovered. One famous example is the story of a woman who lived as a man and became a successful soldier, only being discovered when she was wounded in battle and her comrades saw her body. The reaction to such discoveries varied. Sometimes the person was celebrated for their courage and skill. Other times they were condemned as deceivers and punished severely. The existence of these gender-crossing individuals suggests that medieval people had a more complex understanding of gender and sexuality than the official church teachings would suggest. While the church taught that God had created two distinct sexes and that each had its proper role, the reality was that some people did not fit neatly into these categories and found ways to live according to their own sense of identity. The medieval period also saw the development of a literary tradition that explored same-sex love, though often in coded or allegorical terms. Some of the troubadour songs that celebrated courtly love between men and women could be read as expressing same-sex desire, with the gender of the beloved deliberately ambiguous. Other texts, particularly those written in Latin by educated clergy, were more explicit in their depiction of same-sex relationships. One of the most interesting examples is the poetry of the Archpoet, a 12th century German poet who wrote in Latin. His poems celebrate wine, gambling, and love, including love for young men. While it is possible that these poems were meant to be satirical or were simply following classical models, They suggest that same-sex desire was at least a topic that could be discussed in certain educated circles. The medieval period also saw periodic moral panics about homosexuality, often linked to other perceived threats to social order. During times of crisis, plague, famine, war, there was a tendency to look for scapegoats, and people who engaged in unnatural sexual acts were convenient targets. These moral panics could lead to waves of persecution, with individuals being arrested, tried, and executed for homosexual acts. But between these periodic panics, there were long periods of relative tolerance, or at least of benign neglect. As long as people were discreet and did not openly challenge social norms, they might be able to live their lives without interference. The key was to maintain appearances, to conform outwardly to social expectations while pursuing one's true desires in private. This need for secrecy and discretion created a culture of coded communication and hidden meanings. People who were attracted to members of their own sex learned to recognize each other through subtle signals, a particular way of dressing, certain gestures or phrases, frequenting certain places. These codes allowed them to find each other and form communities, even in a hostile society. The existence of these hidden communities suggests that same-sex love was more common and more organized than the official records would suggest. People found ways to connect with others like themselves, to form relationships, and to create spaces where they could be themselves, at least temporarily. These spaces might be certain taverns, bathhouses, or private homes where like-minded individuals could gather. The medieval period also saw the development of what we might call a subculture around same-sex desire, particularly in urban areas. Cities, with their greater anonymity and diversity, provided more opportunities for people to explore non-normative sexualities. The growth of cities in the later Middle Ages may have contributed to a greater visibility of same-sex relationships, which in turn may have led to increased persecution. The story of same-sex love in the Middle Ages is ultimately a story of resilience and resistance. Despite the severe penalties, despite the social condemnation, despite the need for secrecy and discretion, people continued to love whom they loved. They found ways to express their desires, to form relationships, and to create lives that had meaning and value, even if those lives had to be lived in the shadows. As we continue our exploration of medieval love, we will see how the various forms of forbidden love, whether same-sex relationships, extramarital affairs, or relationships that crossed social boundaries, challenged the rigid structures of medieval society and planted the seeds for future change. But first, we must examine another crucial aspect of medieval love, the role of violence and coercion in sexual relationships. The medieval understanding of love and sexuality had a dark side that we cannot ignore. In a society where women had few legal rights, where marriage was often forced, and where violence was an accepted part of life, sexual coercion and assault were disturbingly common. The line between seduction and rape was often blurred, and the legal and social systems offered little protection to victims. The medieval concept of rape was different from our modern understanding. Rape was seen primarily as a property crime, a theft of a woman's virginity, or a violation of her husband's or father's rights over her body. The woman herself was not seen as the primary victim. Rather, the crime was against the man who owned her sexuality. This meant that the legal response to rape was focused on compensating the male guardian rather than punishing the rapist or supporting the victim. The penalties for rape varied depending on the social status of the victim and the perpetrator. If a nobleman raped a peasant woman, he might face little or no punishment, particularly if he could claim that the woman had consented or had encouraged him. If a peasant man raped a noblewoman, he would almost certainly be executed, not so much for the rape itself as for the presumption of crossing social boundaries. The legal definition of rape was also narrower than our modern understanding. To prove rape, a woman had to show that she had resisted to the utmost of her ability, that she had cried out for help, and that she had reported the crime immediately. If she failed to meet any of these requirements, her accusation might be dismissed, and she might even be accused of having consented to the act. This meant that many rapes went unreported and unpunished. A woman who had been raped by her employer, her lord, or a powerful man in her community might be afraid to report the crime, knowing that she would not be believed and that she might face retaliation. A woman who had been raped by her husband, a concept that did not legally exist in the Middle Ages, had no recourse at all. The idea that a husband could rape his wife was incomprehensible to medieval people. Marriage gave a man the right to his wife's body, and she had no right to refuse him. If he forced himself on her, that was simply his exercising his marital rights, not a crime. This meant that countless women endured sexual violence within their marriages with no possibility of legal protection or escape. The medieval church's teaching on sexuality contributed to this problem. By emphasizing that sex was primarily for procreation and that women should submit to their husbands, the church created a framework that made it difficult to recognize or condemn marital rape. A woman who complained about her husband's sexual demands might be told that she was failing in her wifely duties and that she should submit more willingly. Sexual violence was also common in times of war. When armies conquered a city or defeated an enemy, the rape of women was often seen as part of the spoils of victory. Soldiers would rape women as a way of asserting their dominance, humiliating the defeated men, and rewarding themselves for their military service. These mass rapes were rarely punished and were often tacitly accepted as an inevitable part of warfare. The legal system's response to rape was also complicated by the fact that accusations of rape could be used as a weapon in social and political conflicts. A woman might accuse a man of rape as a way of forcing him to marry her or to extract compensation from him. A family might accuse a man of raping their daughter as a way of pressuring him into marriage or of damaging his reputation. These false accusations, while probably rare, made it easier for people to dismiss genuine accusations as motivated by greed or malice. The medieval period also saw the development of the concept of raptus, which could mean either rape or abduction. This ambiguity reflected the fact that the two crimes were often linked. A man might abduct a woman and then rape her, or he might abduct her with the intention of forcing her to marry him. In some cases, if the man married the woman after abducting her, the crime was considered resolved, even if the woman had not consented to the marriage. This practice of abduction marriage was particularly common in areas where arranged marriages were the norm, and where young people had little say in choosing their spouses. A young man who wanted to marry a particular woman but whose family disapproved might abduct her and rape her, knowing that once her virginity was lost, her family would have little choice but to agree to the marriage. The woman's consent was irrelevant. What mattered was that the marriage would restore her honor and legitimize any children that might result from the rape. The church officially condemned abduction marriage, but in practice, it often accepted such marriages as valid, particularly if the couple had consummated the relationship. This sent a mixed message. Abduction and rape were sins, but they could be remedied by marriage, which was a sacrament. This created a perverse incentive for men to use sexual violence as a way of forcing women into marriage. The medieval legal system also struggled with the question of consent. How could you tell whether a woman had consented to sex or had been raped? The answer often came down to her reputation and behavior. A woman who was known to be chaste and virtuous was more likely to be believed if she accused a man of rape. A woman who had a reputation for being sexually promiscuous, or who had been seen in the company of men without a chaperone, might not be believed, even if she had genuinely been raped. This meant that a woman's sexual history and reputation were often more important than the facts of the case. A woman who had lost her virginity before marriage, whether through rape or consensual sex, was considered damaged goods, and was less likely to be believed if she later accused a man of rape. This created a vicious cycle where victims of sexual violence were blamed for their own victimization and were denied justice. The medieval period also saw the development of various myths and misconceptions about rape that made it harder for victims to be believed. One common belief was that a woman could not become pregnant from rape because conception required female pleasure, and a woman who was being raped would not experience pleasure. This belief, which was based on a misunderstanding of female reproduction, meant that if a woman became pregnant after being raped, she might be accused of having consented to the act. Another common belief was that women secretly desired to be raped, that their protests were merely token resistance designed to preserve their reputation while allowing them to enjoy sex without taking responsibility for it. This belief, which was reflected in some medieval literature and popular culture, made it easier for men to dismiss women's refusals and to justify sexual violence. The medieval romance literature, which celebrated courtly love and chivalry, often contained disturbing elements of sexual coercion. Knights in these stories would sometimes force themselves on women, and the women would eventually come to love them and accept the relationship. These stories sent the message that women's initial refusals should not be taken seriously, and that persistence and force could overcome resistance. The reality of sexual violence in the Middle Ages was that it was pervasive, underreported, and rarely punished. Women lived with the constant threat of sexual assault, whether from strangers, acquaintances, employers, or even their own husbands. The legal and social systems offered them little protection, and the cultural attitudes toward sexuality and gender made it difficult for them to speak out or to be believed when they did. For women who were victims of sexual violence, the consequences could be devastating. A woman who lost her virginity through rape might be unable to marry, as her lack of virginity would be seen as a mark against her. A married woman who was raped might be blamed for the assault, and might even be punished by her husband for having been unfaithful. A woman who became pregnant as a result of rape might be forced to raise the child alone, with no support from the father or the community. The psychological trauma of sexual violence was not recognized or addressed in the Middle Ages. There was no concept of post-traumatic stress or of the long-term emotional damage that sexual assault could cause. Women were expected to simply move on from the experience, to accept it as part of the dangers of being female in a violent world. Those who could not do so, who were haunted by their experiences, or who struggled with depression or anxiety, were seen as weak or mentally unstable. The medieval church's response to sexual violence was inadequate and often harmful. While the church officially condemned rape as a sin, it also taught that women were responsible for guarding their own virtue, and that they should avoid situations where they might be tempted or where they might tempt men. This placed the burden of preventing sexual violence on women rather than on men, and it implied that women who were raped had somehow failed in their duty to protect themselves. The church also taught that sexual sin, including rape, could be forgiven through confession and penance. This meant that a man who raped a woman could confess his sin to a priest, perform some act of penance, and be absolved. The woman, meanwhile, might be left to deal with the physical, emotional, and social consequences of the assault for the rest of her life. The focus on the rapist's spiritual state rather than on the victim's suffering reflected the church's priorities and its limited understanding of the harm caused by sexual violence. Despite the prevalence of sexual violence and the inadequacy of the legal and social responses to it, some women did fight back. There are records of women who physically resisted their attackers, who reported rapes to the authorities despite the obstacles, and who sought justice even when the odds were against them. These women showed remarkable courage and resilience in the face of a system that was stacked against them. There are also records of communities that took action against rapists, even when the legal authorities did not. In some cases, neighbors would band together to punish a man who had raped a woman in their community, driving him out of town or subjecting him to public humiliation. These informal justice systems were rough and imperfect, but they provided some measure of protection and accountability in a world where formal justice was often unavailable. The story of sexual violence in the Middle Ages is a reminder of how far we have come in recognizing and addressing this problem, but also of how much work remains to be done. The medieval attitudes toward rape, that it was primarily a property crime, that women were responsible for preventing it, that a woman's reputation mattered more than the facts of the case, have echoes in modern attitudes and legal systems. Understanding this history can help us recognize and challenge these persistent patterns. As we continue our exploration of medieval love, we must hold both the light and the dark in our minds. The Middle Ages produced beautiful poetry about love, elaborate rituals of courtship, and genuine affection between partners. But it was also a time of forced marriages, sexual violence, and profound inequality between men and women. Both aspects are part of the story, and we cannot understand medieval love without acknowledging both. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the rigid structures that had governed love and marriage for centuries began to show cracks. New ideas about individual choice, personal happiness, and romantic love were beginning to emerge, challenging the old order and planting the seeds for the romantic revolution that would transform Western culture in the centuries to come. One of the most important factors in this change was the growth of cities and the rise of a merchant class. In the countryside, where most people still lived, the old patterns of arranged marriage and family control remained strong. But in the cities, where people were more mobile, more anonymous, and more economically independent, new possibilities began to open up. Young people who moved to cities to work as apprentices, servants, or laborers found themselves free from the direct supervision of their families. They could meet potential partners on their own, form relationships based on mutual attraction, and make their own decisions about marriage. This did not mean that they were completely free. They still needed their master's permission to marry, and they still faced social and economic constraints, but they had more autonomy than their rural counterparts. The growth of cities also created new spaces where young people could socialize. Taverns, markets, festivals, and public squares became places where young men and women could meet and interact with less supervision than in the countryside. These urban spaces allowed for a degree of freedom and experimentation that would have been impossible in small villages where everyone knew everyone else. The rise of the merchant class also began to change attitudes toward marriage. Merchants needed to be able to choose their own business partners and to make decisions based on economic rationality rather than family tradition. This emphasis on individual choice and rational decision-making began to spill over into attitudes toward marriage. If a man could choose his own business partner, why shouldn't he be able to choose his own wife? The Protestant Reformation, which began in the early 16th century, also had a profound impact on attitudes toward love and marriage. The Reformers rejected the Catholic Church's teaching that celibacy was superior to marriage and argued that marriage was a holy estate ordained by God. They also emphasized the importance of mutual love and companionship in marriage, rather than just procreation and social duty. Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, married a former nun and wrote extensively about the joys and challenges of married life. He argued that marriage was not just a legal contract, but a spiritual partnership, and that husbands and wives should love and support each other. This was a significant shift from the medieval Catholic view, which had seen marriage primarily as a remedy for sin and a means of producing legitimate children. The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God also had implications for marriage. If individuals could interpret the Bible for themselves and did not need the mediation of priests, then perhaps they could also make their own decisions about whom to marry. This emphasis on individual choice and personal responsibility would gradually erode the system of arranged marriage and parental control. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century and spread throughout Europe over the next 2 centuries, also contributed to changing attitudes toward love. Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical Greek and Roman texts that celebrated romantic love and individual passion. They began to write about love in new ways, emphasizing personal emotion and individual experience rather than social duty and religious obligation. Renaissance literature and art celebrated the beauty of the human body and the power of human emotion in ways that would have been unthinkable in the early Middle Ages. Poets like Petrarch wrote sonnets that explored the psychology of love in intimate detail. Artists like Botticelli painted scenes of romantic and erotic love that celebrated physical beauty and sensual pleasure. This cultural shift helped to legitimize romantic love as a worthy subject for art and literature. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century also played a crucial role in spreading new ideas about love and marriage. Books that had previously been available only to the wealthy and educated could now be produced cheaply and distributed widely. This meant that ideas about romantic love, which had previously been confined to the courts and the educated elite, could now reach a much broader audience. Popular literature, including romance novels and love poetry, became increasingly available to the middle classes. These books often told stories of young people who fell in love and overcame obstacles to be together, challenging the idea that marriage should be arranged by families for economic and social reasons. While these stories were fictional, they helped to create a cultural expectation that marriage should be based on love and mutual choice. The gradual shift toward companionate marriage based on love and mutual respect rather than just economic and social considerations, was a slow process that took centuries to complete. Even as new ideas about romantic love were spreading, the old system of arranged marriage remained dominant in many parts of Europe well into the 18th and 19th centuries. But the seeds of change had been planted, and they would eventually grow into a full-scale transformation of Western attitudes toward love and marriage. One of the key changes was the growing emphasis on the importance of mutual affection in marriage. While medieval theologians had acknowledged that love might develop between spouses after marriage, they had not seen it as a prerequisite for marriage. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a growing belief that couples should have some degree of affection for each other before they married, and that marriages based solely on economic considerations were likely to be unhappy. This did not mean that economic and social considerations ceased to be important. Parents still played a major role in arranging marriages, and young people were still expected to marry within their social class and to consider the economic implications of their choice. But there was a growing expectation that young people should have some say in the matter, and that their feelings should be taken into account. The concept of courtship also began to change. Instead of marriages being arranged entirely by parents with little or no input from the couple, there was a growing practice of allowing young people to spend time together before marriage to see if they were compatible. This courtship period was still closely supervised, but it gave couples an opportunity to get to know each other and to develop some degree of affection before committing to marriage. The rise of individualism, which was one of the defining features of the early modern period, also contributed to changing attitudes toward love and marriage. As people began to see themselves as individuals with their own desires, goals, and rights, rather than simply as members of families and communities, they began to demand more control over their own lives, including the choice of a marriage partner. This growing individualism was reflected in literature, philosophy, and political thought. Writers and thinkers began to emphasize the importance of individual happiness and self-fulfillment, rather than just duty and obligation to family and community. This shift in values would eventually lead to the modern ideal of marriage as a partnership between equals, based on love, mutual respect, and shared goals. The Enlightenment of the 18th century accelerated these changes. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason, individual rights, and the pursuit of happiness. They questioned traditional authorities and institutions, including the church and the patriarchal family. They argued that individuals should be free to make their own choices about how to live their lives, including whom to marry. Some Enlightenment thinkers went so far as to argue for greater equality between men and women, including in marriage. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her groundbreaking work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, argued that women should be educated and should have the same rights as men, including the right to choose their own husbands. While her ideas were considered radical at the time, they helped to lay the groundwork for the feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries took these ideas even further. Romantic poets and writers celebrated passionate love as the highest human experience and argued that individuals should follow their hearts rather than conforming to social expectations. They wrote about love in ecstatic, almost religious terms, seeing it as a transcendent experience that could lift people above the mundane concerns of everyday life. The Romantic ideal of love emphasized intense emotion, individual choice, and the belief that true love could overcome any obstacle. This ideal was very different from the medieval understanding of love, which had emphasized duty, social obligation, and the subordination of individual desires to family and community needs. The Romantic ideal would become the dominant model for love and marriage in Western culture, shaping expectations and behaviors down to the present day. But the transition from medieval to modern attitudes toward love was not smooth or uniform. Different social classes, different regions, and different religious groups moved at different paces. Among the aristocracy, arranged marriages for political and economic reasons continued well into the 19th century. Among the working classes, economic considerations remained paramount, and romantic love was often a luxury that people could not afford. The persistence of older attitudes and practices alongside newer ones created tensions and contradictions that are still with us today. We still struggle with the balance between individual choice and family expectations, between romantic love and practical considerations, between passion and duty. The medieval period may seem distant and foreign to us, but its legacy continues to shape our understanding of love and relationships. As we near the end of our journey through medieval love, it is worth reflecting on what we have learned. The Middle Ages were a time of rigid rules and harsh punishments, of arranged marriages and limited choices, but they were also a time of passionate devotion, of courtly love and romantic poetry, of people finding ways to love and be loved despite the obstacles. The medieval understanding of love was different from ours in many ways, but it was not entirely alien. Medieval people experienced the same emotions we do: desire, longing, jealousy, heartbreak, joy. They struggled with the same questions about how to balance personal happiness with social obligations, how to find love in a world that often seemed designed to prevent it, how to maintain relationships in the face of hardship and adversity. The story of medieval love is ultimately a story about the human capacity for love and connection in even the most difficult circumstances. It is a reminder that love is not just a modern invention, but a fundamental human experience that has existed in all times and places, even when it had to exist in the shadows, even when it was forbidden, even when it came at a terrible cost. As we reach the end of our exploration of medieval love, it is time to consider the lasting impact of this period on our modern understanding of romance, relationships, and sexuality. The Middle Ages may have ended centuries ago, but their influence on how we think about love is still profound and pervasive. The most obvious legacy of medieval love is the concept of romantic love itself. The idea that love is a powerful, transformative emotion that should be the basis for marriage is a direct descendant of the courtly love tradition. While courtly love was originally about impossible, adulterous passion, it planted the seed of the idea that love was valuable in its own right, not just as a means to an end. The troubadours and romance writers of the Middle Ages created a cultural template for romantic love that we still follow today. The idea of the devoted lover who will do anything for his beloved, the emphasis on the beloved's beauty and virtue, the notion that love involves suffering and sacrifice. All of these come from the medieval courtly love tradition. When we talk about falling in love, or about love as a kind of madness that overtakes us, we are using concepts that were developed in the Middle Ages. The medieval period also gave us many of the rituals and symbols that we still associate with romance. The exchange of rings, the giving of flowers, the writing of love letters, the celebration of Valentine's Day. All of these have medieval roots. Even the diamond engagement ring, which seems like a timeless tradition, has its origins in medieval customs, though it did not become widespread until much later. The language of love that we use today is also heavily influenced by medieval literature. When we call someone our true love or our heart's desire, when we talk about being smitten or love-struck, we are using phrases that come from medieval poetry and romance. The metaphors we use to describe love, love as a wound, love as a fire, love as a journey, were all developed and refined by medieval writers. But the medieval legacy is not entirely positive. The Middle Ages also gave us many problematic ideas about love and relationships that we are still struggling to overcome. The idea that women should be passive and men should be aggressive in romantic relationships, the notion that jealousy is a sign of true love, the belief that love should involve suffering and sacrifice, all of these have medieval roots and all of them can be harmful. The medieval emphasis on female virginity and purity has had a particularly lasting and damaging impact. The idea that a woman's value is tied to her sexual status, that she is damaged goods if she has sex before marriage, that her sexuality belongs to her father and then her husband. These ideas were central to medieval culture, and they continue to shape attitudes toward female sexuality today, even in supposedly progressive societies. The medieval double standard, which judged women's sexual behavior much more harshly than men's, is also still with us. While we have made progress toward greater equality, women are still often judged more harshly for having multiple sexual partners, for being sexually assertive, or for deviating from traditional gender roles. The roots of this double standard lie in medieval attitudes toward gender and sexuality. The medieval understanding of marriage as primarily an economic and social arrangement rather than a romantic partnership has also left its mark. While we now emphasize love and companionship in marriage, practical considerations like economic stability, social status, and family approval still play a significant role in many people's marriage decisions. The tension between romantic ideals and practical realities that characterized medieval marriage is still with us. The medieval church's regulation of sexuality has also had a lasting impact, particularly in Catholic and conservative Protestant communities. The idea that sex is primarily for procreation, that contraception is sinful, that homosexuality is unnatural, these are all medieval ideas that continue to shape religious teaching and practice today. The sexual guilt and shame that many people experience, even in secular contexts, can be traced back to medieval attitudes toward sexuality. The medieval period also established patterns of sexual violence and coercion that persist today. The idea that rape is primarily a crime against male property rights, rather than against the woman herself, the tendency to blame victims for their own assault, the difficulty of proving rape and obtaining justice, all of these have medieval precedents. While we have made progress in recognizing and addressing sexual violence, we are still dealing with attitudes and legal structures that have their roots in the Middle Ages. On the other hand, the medieval period also gave us some positive models that we can learn from. The emphasis on loyalty and commitment in marriage, the idea that love should be expressed through service and devotion, the belief that relationships require work and sacrifice, these are all valuable insights that come from medieval culture. The medieval understanding that love is not just a feeling but a choice and a commitment is particularly relevant in our modern culture of instant gratification and easy divorce. The medieval practice of courtly love, for all its problems, also contained some progressive elements. By placing women on a pedestal and celebrating their power over men, courtly love gave women a kind of agency and influence that they did not have in other areas of medieval life. While this power was limited and often more symbolic than real, it represented a recognition that women had value beyond their reproductive capacity and their domestic labor. The medieval period also saw the development of a rich literary and artistic tradition around love that continues to inspire us today. The love stories of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, Romeo and Juliet, which was written just after the medieval period but drew on medieval traditions. These stories continue to be retold and reimagined because they speak to something fundamental about the human experience of love. The medieval emphasis on the spiritual dimension of love is also worth recovering. In our modern secular culture, we tend to see love as primarily a matter of emotion and physical attraction. But medieval people understood that love could be a path to spiritual growth and self-transcendence. The idea that loving another person can make us better, more virtuous, more fully human, this is a medieval insight that we would do well to remember. The medieval period also reminds us that love has always been complicated, that it has always involved tensions between individual desire and social obligation, between passion and duty, between freedom and constraint. The idea that there was once a simpler, more innocent time when love was straightforward and uncomplicated is a myth. People have always struggled with the same questions about love that we struggle with today. Understanding the history of love in the Middle Ages can help us to see our own attitudes and practices in a new light. It can help us to recognize which of our beliefs about love are timeless and which are culturally specific. It can help us to understand where our romantic ideals come from and to question whether those ideals are serving us well. And it can remind us that love, in all its forms, has always been a central part of the human experience. The medieval period was a time of great creativity and innovation in thinking about love, even as it was also a time of great restriction and oppression. The tension between these two aspects, between the celebration of love in literature and art and the harsh regulation of love in practice, is what makes medieval love so fascinating and so relevant to us today. As we look back on the medieval period from our modern vantage point, it is easy to feel superior, to congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. And it is true that we have made enormous progress in many areas. We have greater freedom to choose our own partners, greater equality between men and women, greater acceptance of diverse forms of love and sexuality. We have legal protections against sexual violence and coercion that medieval people could not have imagined. But we should also be humble enough to recognize that we have not solved all the problems that medieval people struggled with. We still struggle with the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility, between romantic ideals and practical realities, between passion and commitment. We still live in a world where love can be dangerous, where relationships can be oppressive, where sexuality can be a source of shame and guilt. The medieval period has much to teach us, both positive and negative. By understanding how medieval people thought about love, how they practiced it, and how they struggled with it, we can gain insight into our own beliefs and behaviors. We can see which aspects of medieval love we want to preserve and which we want to reject. We can learn from their mistakes and be inspired by their creativity. The story of medieval love is not just a historical curiosity. It is part of our own story, part of the long human journey toward understanding what it means to love and be loved. The medieval period was one chapter in that story, a chapter full of beauty and ugliness, joy and suffering, freedom and constraint. By understanding that chapter, we can better understand ourselves and the world we live in today. As we close this exploration of medieval love, let us remember that love, in all its forms, is what makes us human. It is what connects us to each other and to the generations that came before us. The medieval people who struggled with love, who celebrated it in poetry and song, who suffered for it and died for it, they were not so different from us. They felt the same emotions, asked the same questions, and sought the same things: connection, meaning, happiness, and hope. Their world may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every love song, every wedding ceremony, every romantic gesture. The forbidden rules of medieval love may no longer govern our behavior, but they still echo in our hearts and minds, shaping how we think about love and relationships. And perhaps, by understanding where we came from, we can better understand where we are going, and how we can create a world where love is not forbidden but celebrated, not constrained but free, not a source of suffering but a source of joy.